Good morning, scholars. Ms. Marple here. Today we're going to be talking about the three parts of the cell theory and how prokaryotes and eukaryotes compare and contrast. This is a normal focus like we've been doing since the beginning of the year. What that means for you is you will need to pause this video in order to write these things down in your science journal. One reason that's important is because when we take quizzes, I will be closing the focus that's on your Google Classroom page so that you will need to rely on your notes. All right? So remember, whenever you need to write something down, just pause the video. You can always come back and watch it again later. All right, let's move on. All right, well, I'm still trying to learn this new video format. We'll just move on. First of all, cells were discovered by one of my favorite scientists named Robert Hooke in 1655. This is what his original version of a microscope looked like. So you would put your eye into this, which is called an eyepiece. It has multiple mirrors on the inside, which then focus down here, which is where a specimen would occur. One of the biggest problems, besides coming up with finely ground glass lenses, was the inability to light the specimen. So Hooke had to add a mirror, candle, and water, which would help reflect and focus and intensify the light beam onto the specimen. This was the first thing that he saw. These are the cells of cork, which is a living tree. When he saw it, the specimen was already dead, and because he didn't have a name for this because no one had ever seen them before, he thought that in this picture, they looked a lot like the little rooms that you might look down on inside of a monastery, because Robert Hooke was a scientist who saw things very literally. So these are called cells in a monastery, and that's what he named them also. By the way, some of you have been wondering about this little creature. This is a microanimal called a tardigrade. Tardigrades are, in my opinion, one of the most amazing creatures that have ever lived. The reason for that is that these animals have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They can live essentially almost anywhere. They've been found frozen in glaciers after thousands and thousands of years. They can be found in hot springs that are so hot that you would cook if you fell into one. They have been found preserved perfectly in the sands of deserts thousands of years later, and they all come back to life. They've also even gone up into space. On a previous space mission, a petri dish full of tardigrades, or water bears, was added to the outside of the rocket. It went into space for a year, and when the rocket came back down, not only were all the water bears still alive, they'd had babies. How amazing is that? In addition, one of the more important facts about a water bear is that in all of the mass extinctions that have ever occurred on the planet, the water bear has survived them all basically unchanged. Now, it sounds like the water bear ought to have the right to be a meat eater and ought to be able to attack us in the form of The Walking Dead or World War Z. Thankfully, though, the water bear, the tiny, adorable water bear, only lives in the algae in the mud of the forest. And before long, I will post on our page how you can go and find some, maybe in your own backyard. But back to the lesson. Let's talk first about the cell theory. The first part of the cell theory states that every living thing is made of one or more cells. Second, cells are the basic units of structure and function in every single organism. And three, all cells come from other cells. They do not just spontaneously appear on the hamburger that you left on your kitchen counter for the last weekend. Next, here are a couple of vocabulary terms. First, unicellular means the entire organism is just one cell. Now, this refers to all of bacteria, all organisms called protists, and just a very few others. We'll talk more about these in a moment. Multicellular means that the entire organism is made of many cells, such as you. Nearly all fungi, an important exception, is the yeast cell. In addition, all land plants and all animals are multicellular organisms. Let's go on to question 2 now. You may need to pause to write this down. First, a prokaryote is a single cell, and that means it does not have a nucleus and it does not have any membrane-bound organelles. We'll talk about organelles more in the next lesson. So it's important. They have no nucleus and no little organelles inside that have membrane. This refers to bacteria. They were the first living things on Earth, and although these may look like the sausages I had for breakfast this morning, they are not. They're a shape of bacteria called a bacillus, which are rod shapes. These round shapes are called a coccus, C-O-C-C-U-S. Plural is cocci, and because each of these is made of 2 cells joined together, the shapes are called the diplococcus. Di means 2. Here's a type of bacteria called a spirochete. Spirochetes are spiral-shaped, or maybe they look like your curly fries. Oh, I won't be able to get that image out of my head. Spirochetes are often the nastiest of all bacteria. But keep this in mind. Out of all the bacteria on Earth, 90% of them have nothing whatsoever to do with you and your daily life. 5% of them are harmful. The other 5%, well, we couldn't live without those. Here is an actual salmonella cell invading human tissues. Salmonella is disgusting. Next, a eukaryote is a cell that has a nucleus and everything else inside. And there's a lot. Here is an example of a type of unicellular eukaryote called a protist. Kingdom Protista. They are all microscopic. What I love about these little guys in particular is that this is a photosynthetic protist called a volvox. And they have this clear outer membrane, and inside they have structures called chloroplasts. When I was a kid, I had a toy that was this clear plastic blown up ball, and inside were a bunch of other little balls, and they had bells inside. And so that when you roll the bigger ball, the little balls would all go rolling and rolling and rolling, and the little bells would make that twinkling sound, and it was my favorite toy. So that's why the volvox is my favorite protist, because these roll around, and when they do, all the little chloroplasts go rolling around. And I don't think they make any sounds, but if they did, it would be the cutest sound any protist ever made. Here's a plant cell. Notice the shape. Plant cells tend to be very regular in shape because each of them, in addition to a cell membrane, has something called a cell wall, which helps reinforce it and keep it stable. They tend to have very regular brick-like, rod-like shapes. We'll look at more of these in the next unit. Here are plant cells. These are skin cells. They tend to be very irregularly shaped. The darkly stained portions are called the nucleus. Inside of the nucleus is the genetic material, or DNA. So, plant, animal, and nearly all fungal cells are multicellular eukaryotes, and they're really very much alike under the microscope. They all have a nucleus and lots of organelles. So how are they similar to a eukaryote? First of all, all prokaryotes and all eukaryotes have a cell membrane. Second, they all have a liquid inside that's called cytoplasm. Third, they all have at least one kind of organelle, although please remember that in a prokaryote, these organelles do not have a membrane. Now, how are prokaryotes different from eukaryotes? And there's really not a good way to put this except, let's have a look. Basically, what you just saw is that the eukaryotes get more and more and more complicated. Prokaryotes are like they're like a unicycle. They're very simple, right? You don't have to do much to power a unicycle, but a prokaryote is as complicated in comparison as this Martian rover. First of all, eukaryotic cells are generally much, much larger than a prokaryote. This is actually a good relationship of the size. Next, not only are they much, much smaller, but they're also much more simple. And you know me, of course I was going to show a food analogy. Of course I was. So keep in mind, before we do the next lesson, that prokaryotes are very much smaller and very much more simple than eukaryotes.